Well, let's get started. So far this week, we've been talking about two different arguments primarily for the existence of God, based on empiricist premises, based on something about the world, observations, for example, about the existence of the world and the ordering of causes in series, or about the nature of design, basically the fact that the universe has certain teleological properties that we would normally indicate design or purpose. Today we're going to look at David Hume's critique of these arguments, especially the argument from design, and we're also going to look at other arguments against God's existence that proceed from a posteriori premises. So there is a work of Hume's that he did not dare publish in his lifetime, but it came out after his death, the Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. It is a series of dialogues between certain characters, one of whom is defending these arguments, one of whom is attacking them, and then others who are playing more intermediate roles, trying to find some middle path between the two. In any case, these were scandalous dialogues, and that's the reason they didn't appear until after Hume's death. He thought they would get him into a lot of trouble. Now, he has a whole bunch of arguments against, especially the design argument. We're going to look at some of them in detail, but the basic idea is really this. This argument about design is really an argument from analogy. Think about the way painting starts. You're walking along and you kick a stone. And if somebody said, how did the stone get there? You would unquestionably say, well, I don't know, it's just been there. Maybe. It doesn't really matter. It could have easily occurred there naturally. But if you're walking along and you find a watch, you're not going to say, I guess it could have been there naturally. You're going to take it to have been a human artifact, something that had a design, something that had a purpose. And he says, why? Well, because it has certain properties. It's intricate, it's successful, and he goes on to elaborate what those properties are. And then he says the universe is like that. The universe is like a watch rather than the stone. It too is intricate and successful. It too has these teleological properties, these signs of design. Well, how strong is that analogy between the watch and the universe? Is the universe like a watch, or is it more like a stone? We've got to have faith in the fact that we're choosing the right sort of analogy. And Hume says, how strong is the analogy? Well, he's going to give us a number of arguments, basically, that it's not very strong, that it doesn't really have those properties, or at least doesn't have those properties to a greater extent that it has other properties that would be indicative of a very different sort of thing. He also raises the possibility that the universe might be self-organizing. We see organization in the universe, but maybe that organization isn't a result of design. Maybe it's something that just happens. So can you think of examples of cases where you see something that's a pattern in the universe, but on the other hand, it's not really design, it's just a pattern that forms naturally? Yeah? Crystals. Crystals, exactly. You might find a crystal and you say, whoa, look at that, that's beautiful. That couldn't just happen naturally. Somebody must have designed it. Somebody must have carved this crystal and then carefully put it together inside the quartz and so on. And you might say, no, it just happens that way. It's self-organized. Yeah?
Symmetry in plants.
Good, symmetry in plants. You might say the symmetry of the two sides of a leaf. Signs of design? Well, no, maybe it just grows that way. Other examples of this sort of self-organization. Yeah? Good, I think you have in mind fractal patterns. Yeah, exactly, these fractal patterns you find in plants and in all sorts of other places where you basically get this recursive pattern of patterns within patterns. There's a remarkable fractal structure to a lot of things, to crystals, to the pattern of leaves, to all sorts of naturally occurring phenomena. And once you see the pattern, it's really very, very impressive. On the other hand, it's also the sort of thing that, well, you could think, wow, God is this much more detailed artist than we had imagined. Or you could say, no, there's something about nature that just produces these fractal designs itself. And so it's really more like the stone. It turns out the stone is much more intricate, in fact, than people have thought. Can you think of other examples like that in nature? Yeah?
Plumage of a bird or an animal.
Okay, good. The plumage of a bird. Think about the tail of a peacock. Was that something designed? Do you look at the peacock's tail and say, oh my gosh, that peacock is a beautiful artist. Look what it did on its tail. No, it just grows that way, right? I don't know if you've ever seen peacocks up close, but there are a bunch at Mayfield Park on 35th Street here, so if you've never been there, it's a fun place to go and just walk around and you can see peacocks. My closest encounter with a peacock was actually on a ranch in New Mexico, where it bumped my shiny hubcap with a rental car. was another peacock hiding with, inside the tire. And it started pecking the hubcap. And finally, I had to go out and just purposely muddy up the hubcap so it wouldn't injure itself and the car by doing it. Well, anyway, yeah, those patterns of behavior you might think are patterned, and yet they're not really designed. It's not like someone designed peacocks so that they would see reflections and start pecking them. And then finally, he says, why is it a machine like a watch that we're finding an analogy to? They're presumably traits that the universe has in common with all sorts of other things. For example, what about an animal? An animal is going to have a sort of kind of intricate design. It's going to be successful in being able to survive, let's say. Why isn't the universe like it? Why isn't the universe like an animal? Why isn't it like a vegetable, like a plant that grows? And so he basically says, I'm not sure why we should take a watch, a human artifact, as the proper thing to compare the universe to. Maybe we should really think of it in terms of an animal or in terms of a vegetable. But wait, those things aren't designed, or at least it's not obvious. It would be question-making to say that those things are the product of design. But he also has a number of other arguments, other than just an attack on the power of the analogy. He says, look, if we take this argument seriously, we've got God as a designer of the universe. If we take the cosmological argument seriously, we've got an argument for God as the creator of the universe. Does that give us an argument for an all-powerful, all-knowing, omnipresent being? Something that fulfills the classical conception of God. Does it in particular give us this idea of God as infinite, as infinitely powerful, infinitely knowing, and so forth? And his answer is no. Think about a watchmaker. We find a watch and we think, well, that's pretty impressive. So, here's my example. An Apple Watch, which somebody gave me, by the way. It's great. He didn't know what to do with it. His mom gave it to him and said, I don't know what this is. You want it? Heck yes. Okay. What can I infer about the designer of this Apple Watch? It's pretty cool. It's successful. It tells me the temperature. It tells me how far I've walked today. Well, slowly. There we go, 3,700 steps so far today. It tells me the time, of course, and all sorts of other things. So it's pretty intricate, it's pretty successful. Now, what can we infer about the maker of the Apple Watch? Do we say Apple Corporation? It is all-knowing. It is all-powerful. It is infinite. No, right? But now, what do we infer? What's reasonable to infer about the maker of the watch? Yeah?
They researched the best way to make the watch.
Oh, they researched the best way to make the watch. Together, at least, they must be pretty knowledgeable, right? They presumably know how to do something like this. That's impressive. So it's an impressive artifact. Somebody has a great deal of knowledge. If someone actually creates it, they've got a great deal of power to be able to actually put it together in this sort of way and so forth. Here I'm talking as if it's one person, but of course it's not one person dreaming this up, nor is it one person manufacturing it. But still, for the moment, let's put that question aside. Hume says, look, I've got reason to believe in maybe some very powerful being, some very wise being, some being that knows a lot, but not a perfect being and not an infinite being. He says, by this method of reasoning, you renounce all claim to infinity in any of the attributes of the deity. Now why? Well, the cause ought only to be proportion to the effect. But is the effect infinite? He says, no. Okay? Insofar as all falls under our cognizance, the universe is not infinite. What pretensions have we upon your suppositions to ascribe that attribute to the divine being? So he's worried about this comparison. Even if it's right to compare the universe to a watch or some other artifact, what do we infer about artificers, the people who put together these artifacts? Well, we attribute that to them the knowledge, the power, and so on required to produce that artifact. But we don't ever make it infinite. In fact, a finite artifact suggests a finite being that created it. And so he's worried that this cannot possibly get you to the classical conception of God. But worse than the possible sacrifice of infinity is the sacrifice of perfection. He says, if we examine the world, do we infer that God is perfect? Look, take it seriously. Do you think the person who designed the Apple Watch was perfect? Do you say, wow, this is just a perfect watch? It must have been designed by the perfect being. It tells me the time in Cupertino. I should go to Cupertino and meet the perfect being. No, you don't infer that, right? And so he says, this world, for aught he knows, that is to say, the person making the argument, is very faulty and imperfect compared to a superior standard, and was only the first rude essay of some infant deity, who afterwards abandoned it, ashamed of his lame performance. It's the work only of some dependent inferior deity, and is the object of derision to his superiors. It's the production of old age and dotage in some superannuated deity. And ever since his death has run on as adventures from the first impulse of active force which it received from him. So in other words, can we really infer that God is perfect? Look around the world. Does it really look perfect to you? Does it give us reason to think that God is perfect? He says, what if it isn't a perfect being? What if it's some inferior deity who really, here's the assignment. It's sort of God 101 class. And this deity comes to the class. There's Apollo, meets Juno, meets Cthulhu, and all sorts of deities, past and present. And he's in this God 101 class. And their first assignment, make a universe. And so, the person puts together this universe, and then the rest sit around and critique it and so on. And that's our universe. Well, God, it's still pretty impressive, right? It was produced by some sort of deity, but on the other hand, hardly a perfect one. This was like the intro to engineering thing, where you have to put together this little machine. It was like that in the realm of universes. And so Hume says, how do we know it's really a great universe, anything like a perfect universe, and therefore a perfect designer? What if this is just a barely adequate universe, produced by a barely adequate designer? Well, there's a problem here, as soon as you really start trying to think seriously about this, not just sort of tossing out a wild supposition, but saying, how would we know this? The answer is we'd have to compare this to other possible universes. Leibniz had the view that this is the best of all possible worlds. Why? Because a perfect God would only create the best of all possible worlds. And so there couldn't possibly be a world better than this one. This is the best of all possible. And you say, wait, there are a lot of things wrong with it. Leibniz's response is, but you try to make any of those things better and it just gets worse. Actually, this is the best any possible being can do. And Hume says, how would you ever know? Yeah. Ooh, all right, good. A lot of religious people would say, wait a minute, I'm not claiming that this universe, as is revealed to us in this life, is perfect, right? The perfection is attained somewhere else. And so there is an afterlife. And the afterlife is just, even though this world is unjust. Here, the wicked prosper, and the good suffer. But all of that will be made up in the afterlife. And the same thing is true of all the other imperfections of the world. There will be no more suffering, no more death, no more pain. Look at the vision of the New Jerusalem, the Golden City, the Book of Revelation, where all of these things will go away. There will be no more sea. And so there's a vision there of a perfect world. But you might say, well, okay, good. That's a way in which you could say, maybe this really is the best of all possible worlds, and once we see the full vision, we will realize that this is the way it had to be. In other words, it might be that by the end of the process you say, aha, look what we've achieved. Look at this universe in its wondrous complexity. Maybe this really was the best of all possible worlds. However, here Hume's empiricism is coming in. He's basically saying, what possible experience could I have that convinces me you're right about that? And he looks around and says, I can't make a comparison to other universes. I have experience only of this universe as it's revealed to me now in this lifetime. And so I can't really say what I would judge if I were exposed to the New Jerusalem in a life after death. All I can go on is what I see in this world. And if you ask me to compare it to other worlds, I can't really do it. He says it's impossible for us to tell from our limited views whether this system contains any great faults or deserves any considerable praise if it's compared to other possible and even real systems. So he's really saying, you might be right. It might be that this is actually the best of all possible worlds, and that there is an afterlife in which all the imperfections of this world will be ameliorated, in fact, made perfect. But, he says, I can't tell. I'm not in a position to tell. And so, could be, might be right, but I can't tell. I don't have the experience that would allow me to argue for or against that proposition. So, I've got on the slide there one of my favorite cartoons. I found this about 40 years ago. Parallel universes. In the first one, we've got it's 4:27 p.m. and Mrs. N is baking cookies. Then in another universe, it's ZOS 0.97 ZFK and Mrs. VVV is baking pilkers. And then we've got one with a robot. It's 109 over L and TRR is baking spoo. And then finally, it's just L and something is blah, 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 blah. So we've just got, well, anyway, that's the kind of thing a philosopher thinks is worth saving for 40 years. So, what can I say? Hume says, look, we also don't know that any designer designed this world all at once. Think about the Apple Watch. Was this something someone just sat down and designed? No, right? It went through presumably many test versions, many earlier attempts. The same thing is true of virtually any machine. There were lots of attempts to build this machine, lots of redesigns, lots of elaboration of the design, lots of improvements of the design. And so how do we know that this universe was actually a final product? Maybe there were, for example, earlier botched universes, and this is the, we're in universe 7.0 here. And there were earlier versions that weren't even nearly as good. He says many worlds might have been botched and bungled throughout an eternity ere this system was struck out, and there you see an early attempt at an airplane. The idea there was supposed to be that if you pedal hard enough, it will fly. It didn't work. Okay. But maybe the universe was like that. Maybe, go back to that Mod 101 class, there were a bunch of attempts. You have to try out this universe. Maybe ours wasn't the first. Maybe ours was the final semester product. But still, that doesn't indicate perfection in the designer. Sometimes the design is far better than any individual designer because there's this process of design, of continual, gradual improvement. And then he says, look, maybe it was made by a committee. In fact, did one person produce this watch? No. Did one person design this watch? No, right? It was a team of people working together who actually did the design, who actually did the manufacturing of it. And so maybe the universe was like that. Maybe there was a committee. Maybe people got together and formed, well, not people, exactly, deities of some kind, maybe, very powerful beings, giants, whatever, got together and formed the world-making committee. And they produced this universe. And so he says maybe a great number of men, think about the analogy, a great number of men joined together in building a house or a ship, or in raising a city and framing a commonwealth. What about the possibility of several deities getting together to contrive to frame a world? So maybe it was actually a team of designers, a team of builders, and that thought is actually not that obscure. As we'll see, there is a famous theologian in the tradition who actually says, why are there imperfections in the universe? Because God delegated the construction of the world to the angels. And so there really was a committee of builders, and they weren't perfect, and so this is the result. I'm not recommending that as a good theology, but I'm just saying that is a possible way of responding. Well, here is the general pattern of human skepticism. He is in effect saying, look, the design argument, or for that matter, the cosmological argument, but let's just focus on design, is building an argument about a certain hypothesis, saying the universe is like a watch, it has an intricate structure, it's successful at perpetuating itself, and so it must have had a designer. And he's saying there are many hypotheses that are possible. Maybe it did have one all-knowing, all-powerful, perfect designer. But maybe it was the result of a committee process. Maybe it was a series of earlier botched universes that led up to this one. Maybe this actually was one of the earlier botched universes, et cetera, et cetera. There are all sorts of possibilities. And so the very first of these points, this is a general pattern we'll notice later of skeptical arguments. There are many hypotheses that are possible. How could it have gone that this universe was produced, that this universe was created, that it was designed, if it was designed at all, or just grew spontaneously, or was produced spontaneously? How did any of that happen? He says, look, you can have a lot of different hypotheses. That's the variability premise. But then there's an undecidability premise. How could we decide among these various hypotheses? He says, we have no evidence that would let us select the most probable hypothesis. So, here's the problem. We have no experience with the creation of universes. And so we have no way of telling which of these hypotheses might be more plausible than another. With processes we do have some familiarity with, we do have reasonable hypotheses. You can usually tell, or at least form a reasonable guess, about whether a work of art, for example, was something that was the result of one artist working, or whether it was a committee decision. You might not be sure, but nevertheless, you could have things that would indicate that that work of art was produced by one artist, or that it was the result of a team of artists, for example. What would be a sign in a work of art that it was produced by one artist? Well, a signature, yeah, good. Picasso, right? that would be a sign. What else? Yeah. Good, same kind of brush stroke throughout the painting, for example. That would indicate a kind of unity of the person actually doing this. Can you think of other things? Yeah.
Some sort of mark that specifically they do, every time on every one of the paintings, something like that.
Ah, good. Something that is a mark characteristic of that particular artist. Can you give me some examples of things that would point toward a team of artists? Yeah.
Different styles.
Ooh, different styles throughout the painting. Yeah.
If it's really big, like maybe like architecture.
Ooh, good. It's really big. Do you think that one person built Bernard Hall? No, right? You laugh. But now, I have a limestone wall that I built this past summer in my backyard. It goes for about 40 feet, and in parts it's only about this tall, and in parts it's about this tall. But if you look at that and you say, whoa, one person built that wall? Or I bet a lot of people built that wall. It's not that big, right? You'd probably say, yeah, one person could easily have built that wall. But a building like this, I mean, it could be. It could be there was one guy, Mr. Bernard, who sat here, brick on brick, right? And did this, and it was like, he spent 60 years, but he tried to go. But no, you think that's really unlikely. It's so big, it surely took a bunch of different people. Now, the problem here is, look, if we try to apply that reasoning to the universe, we think this universe is really big. It's way bigger than the wall, way bigger even than Bernard Hall. And so that's an argument in favor of thinking a lot of people did it. But leave that aside. Hume says, look, all of that is about a work of art. We've seen works of art produced, we've seen buildings produced, we've seen walls produced. But if we ever seen universes produced, do we know what it would be to say, that's a one-person designed universe, but this is a multiple-person designed universe? We don't know what that would be. We have no idea how to begin thinking about that. So there is just no evidence that could lead us to select one hypothesis over another. The animal, the vegetable, the mineral, the artifact, like watch, sort of analogy, we don't know which of those is most plausible. We have no way of telling. And so the conclusion is we can't choose among the possibilities. There is no rational way to make a choice and have it be supported by evidence, so we can't establish God's existence. Now notice it would follow from this that we can't establish God's non-existence either. If that's all we've got, we've just got a bunch of hypotheses. Maybe God exists as a perfect being. Maybe the polytheists in Greece and Rome were right, there are many gods. Maybe there's no God at all. Well, he's in effect saying we could not have any evidence in favor or against these propositions. He says at one point, we have no data on which to establish any system of cosmogony, in other words, of the origins of the universe. Our experience, so imperfect in itself and so limited both in extent and duration, can afford us no probable conjecture concerning the whole of things. So, he looks around and he says, what could help us decide this controversy? And he says, there's nothing I can even imagine. By what phenomenon in nature could we possibly decide this? He can't see anything that would help us decide. Now, is there anything at all that could help us decide? For example, whether God exists. Which of these hypotheses is actually correct? Let me go back to your idea. Suppose you die. And after you die, you first, you're aware of things slipping away. You feel like your spirit is rising above your body. You see a light. You start being drawn toward the light. And you emerge into this space that looks like clouds. And there are these pearly gates in front of you. And there is St. Peter at the gates with a large door. And he says, so what's your name and UTE-ID? But anyway, he opens the book, and he says, all right, you're in the book. And so you go in, and there is the choir of heavenly angels singing hymns to God there on a huge throne. Well, you might think, okay, I believe now. Okay. It's interesting, Bertrand Russell, one of the 20th century's most famous atheists who argued against this, I had a book called Why I Am Not a Christian, and argued against the existence of God, was asked, so what would happen if you died and you had that sort of experience? What would you say? He said, well, I'd say, not enough evidence. There wasn't enough evidence for me to believe there. But he admitted there could be a possible experience. The difficulty is that it just lay beyond the bounds of this life. And so Hume is really saying, look, why what phenomena in nature we've got to decide this question or evaluate this issue here and now. Not, it's like, well, I'll tell you after I die. Oh, except I won't be able to, sorry. Instead, it's sort of like, look, right now, we're not in a position to decide the controversy. So I can imagine something that would lead me to decide, but on the other hand, I can't envision it happening now. There's no phenomenon in nature that I can use. But actually, Hume's arguments point in a direction that is somewhat more negative than just skeptical suspension of judgment. Is there a God? Is there not a God? If there is a God, what's God like? Are there many gods? Hume is so far seeming to say we have no way of telling. The best thing to do is just reserve judgment. However, he then talks about difficulties in nature, things that seem to be indications of imperfection in the world. So, for example, he says, this is not by any means what we expect from infinite power, infinite wisdom, infinite goodness. If you were infinitely powerful, infinitely wise, infinitely good, would you create a world like ours? And he says, gee, I don't think so. Why is there any misery at all in the world? Not by chance, surely. From some cause then. Is it by the intention of the deity? But he's perfectly benevolent. Is it contrary to his intention? But he's almighty. And so he is in effect asking, why is there evil? If God is perfect and this world is the product of the design and creation of a perfect God, why does evil exist? In general, there are three arguments that have advanced throughout history against God's existence. One of them is an a priori argument, and I'm not really going to spend time on it today. I'll just mention it briefly. But two of them are a posteriori arguments. And one of those is from the completeness of physics, or science, and the other is the argument from evil, which is what Hume is raising here. So, the argument from incoherence, the a priori argument, is really just a way of saying the idea of God doesn't make any sense. There couldn't even be a God. And people have raised puzzles like this one. Can God make a rock so heavy he can't lift it? Or could God surrender his own power? Does he have the power to become powerless, for example? Could God resign and become something other than God? I mean, there are times when the burden must be immense. I was chair of the philosophy department for 10 years. It was a difficult burden. I was happy to quit. Well, I had the chance to quit. I had the opportunity to quit. But can God quit? Can God say, oh, man, another Monday morning, I just can't do it anymore. I retire. Well, if not, then there's something God can't do. Okay, or omniscience. I think I am. Could God know that? God can't sort of get inside my head and know that from a first-person point of view. Could God forget anything? And finally, a puzzle about goodness. If God is perfectly good, could God do evil? Well, I'm not going to, as I said, focus on that. Most people think these puzzles are annoying but not ultimately deep. Some people think they're deep problems. But what I wanted to talk about, since we're discussing the empiricist tradition, is really the other two arguments, the ones that are based on experience. So here is one of them. The argument from physics, I'm calling it. The idea is that physics is complete. It offers a complete physical explanation for everything. And what room is left for God, really? In the end, the hypothesis that God exists just explains nothing. If you want an answer to a question, look to science. Okay? And saying, yes, but God was behind this. God actually was supporting those laws, and God created the universe and so on, just gives us no additional information. It contributes nothing, because there's nothing left to explain. Here's how an enlightened scientist put it, Laplace, given the state of the world at any time, if we understand the laws of physics, we can predict the state of the world at any other time, forward or back. At one point, he wrote a book on science, on the nature of physics. Napoleon asked him, why is there no mention of God in your book? And his answer is, I have no need of that hypothesis. In short, invoking God just does nothing to contribute to a scientific understanding of the world. And in the background here is something philosophers call Occam's razor, after William of Ockham, who introduced this idea, you shouldn't multiply entities beyond necessity. Introduce in your understanding of the world only the things you need to explain what's going on in the world. And if we don't need the hypothesis of God, to throw it out. It's doing nothing. Here is how Aquinas puts this argument. You might have noticed in the Aquinas reading that he gives you a question, and then he gives you certain objections, he calls them. These are basically arguments on that question that disagree with his position. So he states these, and then he puts some either a bit of scripture or an earlier church authority, and then he says, here is my view. And then he responds to those objections in his replies. So this is in the part he is treating as an objection. So I want to explain that so you don't think Aquinas is giving this argument. That would be odd for one of the great fathers of the church to be giving an argument for atheism. But he's stating it as one of these objections to which he's going to reply. Anyway, here's how he frames it. It seems that everything we see in the world can be accounted for by other principles, in short, by the laws of science. Supposing God didn't exist, for all natural things could be reduced to one principle, which is nature. And all voluntary things can be reduced to one principle, which is human reason or will. Therefore, there's no need to suppose God's existence. And his reply is very short. He just says, well, I've already given you the cosmological argument. All things are changeable and capable, that are changeable and capable of defect, must be traced back to an immovable and self-necessary first principle. So in short, he basically says, the cosmological argument is the proper reply to this. Nature can't be understood in its own terms, because we can always say, but why that? You say, look, everything results from the laws of physics and the Big Bang. And Aquinas' response is, but why the Big Bang? And why are those the laws of physics? Physics can't explain that. Here's one way of thinking of it. At certain points, no matter what our physical theory looks like, there are going to be things we take as fundamental, as basic axioms or as basic initial conditions for the universe. So maybe the Big Bang is the initial condition. Maybe there is some kind of understanding of what the laws are, and we say, these are the laws. Whatever the physical theory looks like, it's going to be like that. There will be laws, there will be initial conditions, and you can always ask, why those? Why those laws? Why those initial conditions? And nature itself, science itself, won't be able to answer the question. So nature itself points to something outside itself, he would say. And that's the proper reply to the argument from physics. But in any case, Hume doesn't go into all of that. I want to focus on what he does talk about, the problem of evil. And here is the argument as he frames it, taking this over ultimately from Epicurus in ancient times. If God exists, he is all good, all-knowing, and all-powerful. Okay, so he's giving us here the classical conception of God. We think of God as all good, as omniscient, as omnipotent. But if he's all good, he's willing to prevent evil. If God is all-knowing, God knows how to prevent evil. If God is all-powerful, then God can prevent evil. But wait, there is evil. Evil exists. So the conclusion is God doesn't exist. If God existed, God would have to be all-good, all-knowing, and all-powerful, but then he'd be willing and able to prevent evil. He would know how to do it. So surely there would be no evil if God is perfect. But there is evil. Now, here is how he gets to that conclusion. There's an important unstated assumption, which is this. If God were willing to prevent evil, knew how to prevent it, and was able to prevent it, then evil would not exist. And so the argument is only going to be as strong as each of its premises, and that's one that isn't explicitly stated by Hume, but of course it's what's needed to tie those points that he's made together to the conclusion that God doesn't exist. So, let's look at each of these premises for a moment. If God exists, he's all good, all-knowing, and all-powerful. That's really a statement, a part of, anyway, the classical conception of God. And so it would be possible to conclude in the end, well, maybe God exists but isn't all good. Maybe God's only pretty good. Or maybe God isn't all-knowing. Maybe God knows a lot. But, I mean, do you think you're going to emerge from this class knowing everything about philosophy? Even if you're the best student in the class, you probably won't have a perfect score. In fact, on my exams, I think there are only 2 students who have ever gotten a perfect score on one of my exams, let alone a whole course. And so you might think, maybe God was like a really fantastic student, but, doesn't know everything. Or maybe God isn't all powerful. Maybe God is a really powerful being, but isn't all. So in short, we can give up one of those arguments. But we could also then say, what about this additional premise? Let's think about an analogy. Do you think your parents were willing to prevent you from suffering? maybe not, maybe that's bad. Do you think they knew? I mean, think about a child, right? The parents are willing to stop the child from encountering anything bad that will hurt them. They may know how to prevent it. They may be able to prevent it. But are there any occasions where a parent would let the child suffer, would let the child get into trouble, despite all? Yeah.
So they can learn.
So they can learn. Okay, good. Now, we don't have to think that this parent would be awful. I mean, there's a story about that. You know, dad takes his child, puts him up on the table, and says, jump off, I'll catch you. The little kid says, no, it's scary, it's high up here, I don't think it hurts. And he says, oh, trust me, I'll catch you. And the child says, I don't know. He says, come on, I'll catch you, it's okay, jump. So the child jumps, the dad takes a step back, and the kid falls. And it's hurt. So, once he gets, through the tears enough to speak, he says, why did you do that? The dad says, I wanted to teach you a lesson. Don't trust anybody. We don't have to assume that God is like that. There are times when good parents actually allow the child to get into trouble so that they can learn. If you stop a child from ever encountering difficulties, ever getting into trouble, then really you're spoiling them and they don't know how to deal with difficulties. So I'm not sure that underlying assumption is right. But in any case, here's how Aquinas states the argument. Again, is one of these objections to which he's going to reply. If God existed, there would be no evil discoverable. But there is evil in the world, so God doesn't exist. Now, what kinds of evils are there in the world? There are, broadly speaking, two kinds. One, there are moral evils. Moral evils like war, or murder, or terrorism, or the Holocaust, genocide. There is a display case full of skulls from the murders of Pol Pot in Cambodia, the killing fields. But there are also natural evils. And in a way, natural evils are even harder for somebody to account for. Because war, murder, genocide, all of these horrible things that human beings do to one another, you could blame on us. You could sort of say, well, don't blame God for genocide. Don't blame God for war, for murder, and so on. People are doing that to other people. It's their fault, it's not God's fault. But what about natural evils? What about earthquakes, for example? Or tornadoes? What about tsunamis? Or dust storms? What about sickness? It's a disturbing poster, but certainly communicates the point. But ultimately, death. Death is maybe the worst of all. Yes, suffering is a bad thing, but in the end, you can think that suffering is for a point. But in the end, what about death? Beings die. What's the argument that a good God would allow that? Well, we can focus on that premise. Okay, if God actually wants to prevent evil, knows how and can prevent evil, then there wouldn't be evil. But what is the argument for that premise exactly? We don't really find one here. And that opens up the possibility to a number of responses. So, to close out today, I just want to look at a few of the replies. Some of these by philosophers in an empiricist tradition, some by philosophers in other traditions, that try to say, well, wait a minute, it's not so simple. Yes, it's a problem. It gives rise to the need for what people refer to as a theodicy, an explanation for how it's possible for there to be evil in the world, even if God exists. But it's not as if people just give up the game and say, oh, yes, there's evil, so there is no God. Maybe the existence of evil and the existence of God can be reconciled. So here's one possible response from Augustine. It's really part of the plan. He says, look, we've got to judge the universe as a whole, not part by part. And so we have to think about it in the biggest possible sense, including perhaps the afterlife. So here's his analogy. What is the best sort of human life to lead? Suppose you were going to write a biography of someone, or make a movie about someone. Would you want it to be somebody whose life really contained no adversity? My movie's going to be about Joe Smith. Well, tell me about Joe. Well, he grew up in an affluent family, always did well in school, got along well with his friends, went to college, did fine, got a good job when he got out, got married. It was a good life. He died. And I think, well, Okay, that's great. And, most of us would think, yeah, I'll sign up for that life if that's my choice. But on the other hand, you could say, well, that's not a very interesting life. That's not very compelling. But suppose you say, no, I already know Ralph Smith. And Ralph Smith, man, he grew up in poverty. He had it tough. He, made all sorts of mistakes. He was beaten by his teachers. He was locked in closets. Then he went into a life of crime. But despite all of that, he ended up becoming the world's greatest philosopher. Whatever your story goes like, you say, yeah, look, the best life to write about. The best life, in a sense, to me, isn't one where you just never encounter any adversity. It's one where you encounter adversity and overcome it. So the best life is one with adversity overcome. Similarly, the best universe will be one with adversity overcome. Not where everything's just fine. I mean, if I were designing the universe, we'd probably only have a few people in it that all sit around and eat s'mores all day and not get fat. And, listen to great music and talk about philosophy and just goof off. But look, that really the best of all possible universes? That's a good Saturday night or something, but that might not be a great universe. So he says, look, in the end, it's good that there's some evil. It's a better universe for having some evil within it. This is Aquinas' reply, which I think is along similar lines. In fact, he quotes Augustine. He says, as Augustine says, since God is the highest good, he wouldn't allow any evil to exist in his works unless his omnipotence and goodness were such as to bring good even out of evil. So the evil that exists in the world must be something that in the end produces good, even if we don't quite see how that's happening. He says this is part of the infinite goodness of God, that he should allow evil to exist and out of it produce good. So it's a very similar argument. The best universe isn't really one with no evil, it's one with evil out of which comes good. Augustine gives a number of other replies. One is just the argument from general providence. He says, look, there is a system of natural laws that governs the universe, and in which God has made a huge investment. It underlies everything good. Without those natural laws being what they are, life would not be possible. The wonderful things that we human beings can achieve, great amounts of knowledge, great monuments, art, literature, all of these things couldn't exist without those natural laws. But those natural laws also have other consequences. The same laws that produced Michelangelo and Shakespeare also produced tsunamis and tornadoes. And that's just the way it is. There is no way to do better, getting rid of the possibility of harm without disrupting the things that make good possible in the universe. And in the end, the good far outweighs the evil. Those laws have costs. They're great laws. They're laws that make life and all of the wonderful things about it possible. But they have a downside. And there may be no way to revise them to get rid of the downside without destroying the good. Augustine also gives this answer. He says, look, think of evil. God is something that exists, but as a privation, as a lack. It's an absence, he says. It's not a thing. And so his answer ultimately is this. God didn't create evil. He simply created things with differing degrees of goodness. But that variety itself is good. So he imagines it this way. Here is a good, in fact, a perfect God, who says, well, here's a perfect universe, one with just a perfect God, it just has a perfect being. But is it the best possible universe that God thinks? No. A better universe would actually have other wonderful things in it. But those things, by definition, are not going to be perfect. There couldn't be two perfect beings. And why not, by the way? Because they'd both be all-powerful, and this one could destroy that one, but this one could have the power not to be destroyed by that one, so it couldn't happen. So if God's going to create anything, it has to be imperfect. So you get a bunch of things with different degrees of evil in them. You get some things that are corruptible and imperfect. And so think of, these things existing in the world with different degrees of goodness. It's good that they exist, but that gap between the goodness that they have and perfection, that's what we call evil. And so any universe with a multiplicity of things in it, with the richness of our universe, is going to have a lot of imperfection, because not all things can be perfect. But he also says, look, some of this may be our fault. Surely people do terrible things to other people. You can't blame that on God. Maybe our free will explains a lot of things. Now, it can't explain natural evils, really. Although, on the other hand, we're the ones who choose to build in floodplains and so on and so forth. But he says, nevertheless, look, some things are our fault. Maybe in the end, lots of things are our fault. Maybe it's punishment for original sin. On the other hand, who gave us the capacity and inclination to do wrong? Well, God. So in the end, he says, I don't think this problem is fully solved. In short, Augustine admits at the end, despite all of these arguments, that he's not showing you why a perfect God would create evil. He's just saying it's a logical possibility, but in the end, we can't really understand God. All right, so let me just go to this last slide here. Possible solutions. What could we do? If we think of God as a perfect being, and yet we think of the world as containing evil, like over there in the lower right-hand corner, what could have happened? What could we blame it on? And there are historically a number of different options. You can think, well, God had a design for the world, its form, and God built it out of matter. And the building process, of course, takes place. And then, of course, human beings arise. And then there ends up being evil. So what could we say? We could deny that there's evil, as Augustine seems to do, and as Hinduism does, and Plotinus does. We can say, no, there's no evil. They're just different degrees of goodness. We can blame it on man, as Origin does, and say it's all free will, and it's our fault. We can go back to the building stage, and we can say, look, there's a great design, and wonderful materials, but God delegated the work to the angels and screwed up. And that really is Philo's answer in the end for why there's evil. In fact, he uses that as an argument for the existence of the angels. There had to be some builders, and it couldn't have been God because God's perfect, so there had to be inferior builders. All right. The design, look, that's directly from a perfect God. It couldn't be the design, but maybe it's the matter. And so Plato, the Gnostics, Mani, and Avicenna all blame matter and say, yeah, it was built out of raw materials. But what are you going to do? That's all God had. So, in short, there are a number of different options. And I'll just conclude with an argument that Alvin Plantinga has given. Look, evil's a problem for the atheist too, he says, because if there's no God, then there's really nothing but the natural world. But if so, really there's no ought. There just isn't. In other words, there's no such thing as good or evil in the world described by science. That isn't something you find in the laws of physics. So in the end, if you think there is evil, there must be a standard of goodness that allows us to distinguish good from evil. But that, he ends up saying, presupposes the existence of